I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get caught up in some twisted family drama over money, but here I am. My name is Julia, and this happened 3 years ago, right after my father passed away. I was 34 at the time, living in a small apartment with my cat, working as a project manager for a mid-sized company. My relationship with my family had always been complicated. My mom had passed away when I was a teenager, and after that, my father and my older brother Jake grew closer while I became more independent. I never thought much of it. Jake was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. I was just the daughter who didn't need help. That's what my father always said, and honestly, I believed it. When my father died, it was sudden, a heart attack in his sleep. It was devastating, of course, but grief turned into something much worse when I started asking about the will. Jake kept brushing me off, saying he was handling things, and that Dad didn't leave much behind anyway. That didn't sit right with me. My father wasn't rich, but he owned a house, had a decent savings account, and had always been careful with money. The more Jake avoided the conversation, the more suspicious I became. Then, a few weeks later, I found out the truth in the worst way possible. By accident. I was at my dad's house, the place I had practically grown up in, helping sort through his belongings. Jake had been oddly reluctant to let me inside, but I insisted. While looking through old papers in my dad's study, I found an envelope buried under a pile of outdated bills. It was a copy of his original will, dated 5 years ago. My heart pounded as I read it. Everything, his house, his savings, even some investments I didn't know he had, was meant to be split equally between me and Jake. But that wasn't what Jake had been telling me. I took a picture of the document and confronted him that same night. He barely even flinched. Instead, he scoffed and said something I'll never forget. That doesn't mean anything anymore. His confidence shook me. That's when he admitted, without a shred of shame, that he had fixed things after Dad passed. He had the will altered, made it look legitimate, and filed it before I even had a chance to ask questions. Everything was now legally his. And since I hadn't been involved in the process early on, fighting it in court would be a nightmare. "You wouldn't win," he said with a smirk. "Not against me." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make him feel even a fraction of the rage boiling inside me. But I didn't. Instead, I forced myself to stay calm. If he was so confident that I couldn't do anything about it, that meant he had covered his tracks well. Too well for me to fight him impulsively. So I swallowed my anger, gave him the coldest look I could manage, and simply said, "We'll see." That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to beg, cry, or plead. I was going to destroy him, quietly, methodically, and without him ever seeing it coming. For the next few months, I played the part of the defeated little sister. I acted hurt but resigned, like I had accepted that he had won. Meanwhile, I started gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I visited the lawyer who had originally handled my father's will, and though she couldn't discuss much, she let something slip. She had been surprised when Jake came in alone, just a day after Dad died, with updated paperwork. That confirmed my suspicions. I also pulled my father's bank records and found something even worse. Jake had started draining accounts before the will was even processed. He had been planning this long before Dad passed. I knew that if I wanted to take Jake down, I needed something undeniable, something that would make it impossible for him to weasel his way out. So, I got creative. I reached out to a friend from college who worked in forensic document analysis. I sent her a copy of both wills, the real one I had found and the forged one Jake had submitted. A week later, she confirmed what I already suspected. The signatures didn't match. Not just that, but the ink and paper of Jake's version were inconsistent with the date it was supposedly signed. It was a sloppy forgery, and now I had proof. But I wasn't done. I needed leverage. I started digging deeper into Jake's finances, and that's when I hit gold. Turns out, my dear brother had been living far beyond his means. The house wasn't fully paid off, and he had racked up a mountain of debt trying to maintain an image of success. He had taken out shady loans, some with terrifyingly high interest rates. If he didn't have my father's assets, he'd be ruined. And that's when I saw my opening. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to make sure he lost everything. I spent weeks preparing, making sure every piece of evidence was airtight. Then, when I was ready, I struck. First, I anonymously tipped off the bank about irregular activity in my father's accounts. Since he had passed, no one should have been withdrawing money, but Jake had, and that was enough to trigger an internal review. Next, I sent copies of the forged will to the lawyer who had initially handled my father's estate, along with a very carefully worded email suggesting that she might want to take a closer look at the documents Jake had submitted. Lawyers hate being dragged into fraud cases, and I knew she wouldn't ignore something that could put her reputation at risk. But the real masterpiece? I went straight to his creditors. Using the financial records I had gathered, I contacted a few of the more aggressive lenders and casually mentioned that Jake had recently come into a large inheritance. He had been dodging their calls for months, but once they heard that he had access to assets, they came down on him like a pack of wolves. Within days, he was drowning in demands for immediate payment. And then, just as the pressure was mounting, the legal side of things kicked in. The bank froze the accounts, the lawyer filed an official complaint, and Jake's entire fraudulent empire started crumbling before his eyes. Jake didn't see it coming. One minute, he was sitting pretty, thinking he had won, and the next, everything was spiraling out of control. His accounts were frozen, his creditors were breathing down his neck, and worst of all, the lawyer he had used to submit the forged will suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. Apparently, she had been too careless in processing his documents, and now that the fraud was under investigation, she was at risk of losing her license. I imagine she wasn't too happy about that. She turned on Jake almost immediately, providing statements that conveniently distanced herself from him while confirming that he had handled everything on his own. In other words, she threw him under the bus. And then came the final blow. With all the evidence I had gathered, I filed a lawsuit contesting the will, backed by the original documents and expert testimony proving the forgery. Jake, now drowning in legal fees and debts, had no way to fight back. His assets, my father's assets, were seized pending investigation, meaning he couldn't access a single cent of the money he had stolen. It was poetic justice. He had taken everything from me, believing he was untouchable, but in the end, his own greed and arrogance were his undoing. The fallout was brutal. Jake tried to fight back, of course. He always had that smug confidence, like he could talk his way out of anything. But this time, there was no escaping it. His fraudulent will was declared invalid, and my father's original wishes were reinstated. The estate was officially split 50-50 between us, just as it should have been from the start. But by then, it didn't even matter. Jake was so deep in debt that he had no way to hold on to his half. The house? Sold off to cover what he owed. The accounts? Seized for investigation, and eventually drained to pay off his creditors. He lost everything. And me? I walked away with exactly what my father had intended for me, my rightful inheritance. But more importantly, I walked away knowing I had outplayed him. No screaming, no pointless fights, no begging for justice. Just quiet, calculated revenge. And the best part? To this day, Jake doesn't know it was me who set everything in motion. As far as he's concerned, the universe simply turned against him. The last time I saw him, he looked worn down, exhausted, like a man who had lost everything and had no one to blame but himself. I just smiled, wished him the best, and walked away. Because I had already won. After everything settled, I took my time deciding what to do with my half of the inheritance. I didn't want to rush into anything. I had fought too hard for this, and I wasn't going to waste it. I paid off my debts, moved into a nicer apartment, and even quit my job to start my own business. It was something I had always dreamed of, but never thought I could afford. Funny how life works. Meanwhile, Jake was still dealing with the mess he had created. He had to downsize, sell off his car, and from what I heard through the grapevine, he was struggling to find stable work. No one wants to hire someone who just got caught in a fraud case, even if he managed to avoid jail time. But the best part? Our relatives, especially the ones who had always favored Jake, started to see him for who he really was. For years, he had played the role of the responsible, successful older brother, while I was just the difficult one who asked too many questions. But now they knew. They saw how easily he had betrayed me. how far he had gone just to take what wasn't his. And slowly, one by one, they started distancing themselves from him. He lost not just money, but his reputation, his connections, and the blind admiration he had always relied on. And I didn't have to lift a finger. The last real conversation I had with Jake was about a year after everything fell apart for him. He called me out of nowhere, his voice dripping with forced humility. He tried to play it cool at first, acting like he just wanted to catch up, but I could hear the desperation underneath. And then, after a bit of awkward small talk, he finally got to the point. He needed money. He fed me some sob story about a business opportunity that would help him get back on his feet, and how, since I had won, maybe I could be generous and help him out. I let him talk. I let him ramble about how hard things had been, how unfair life was, how he had made some mistakes, but was trying to move forward. And when he finally stopped to take a breath, I simply said, "You wouldn't win. Not against me." Then I hung up. That was the last time I ever heard his voice. No more begging calls, no more fake charm, no more lies. Just silence. And I have to admit, nothing in my life has ever felt as satisfying as that moment. Since then, I've moved on. I built a life for myself, one that wasn't weighed down by my family's expectations or by the bitterness of being overlooked. I traveled, made new friends, and for the first time, I felt free. Free from the need to prove myself to people who never really saw me. The house my father left behind, I sold it and used the money to buy a place of my own, one that didn't carry the ghosts of betrayal. Every choice I made after that was mine, and mine alone. As for Jake, last I heard he was barely scraping by, bouncing from job to job, his name tainted by his own actions. No one trusts a man who would steal from his own sister, and certainly not one dumb enough to get caught. And honestly, I don't feel bad for him. He made his choices. He thought he was untouchable. He thought I would roll over and accept whatever crumbs he decided to throw my way. But he was wrong, because in the end, I didn't just take back what was mine, I made sure he could never steal from anyone again. And that, to me, is justice.